So last night we heard Jean share about his experience during the Rwandan genocide, and about 15 years ago my husband and I were involved in some media work around the 10-year anniversary of the genocide. And as I learnt about what happened in Rwanda when neighbour turned against neighbour and the Hutu majority slaughtered the Tutsi minority over a period of 100 days, the thing that struck me the most was my own lack of awareness. My own lack of awareness to it while it was happening. In 2004, I looked back and wondered how it could have happened. I wondered how I sat by and didn't even realize that it was happening. I was a year out of high school. I should have been aware, and I really couldn't have told you the facts. Again, last night, Stephen read that quote from 1939 that could have easily been the news headlines today. And I've had that same experience over the past 6 or 8 months as I've read memoirs and reports from the time of the Jewish Holocaust, words that could be referring to any of the scenes that are playing out today. And in March 2015, as I stood in Yad Vashem in the World Holocaust Center in Jerusalem, I was again confronted by the fact that the world had sat by and let a devastation of human life occur. I read a statement that was on the wall in the memorial, and it was made by the representative from my country of Australia at a global gathering during the Holocaust where they were trying to find a solution. And his response was, "It will no doubt be appreciated also that as we have no real racial problem, we are not desirous of importing one by encouraging any large scale of foreign migration. I hope that the conference will find a solution to this tragic problem." And of course, we look back with the advantage of hindsight and altruism at what could have been done. Of course, there were those who did do things, and many people who risked their own lives to save Jewish lives. But when we look back on these atrocities, we're appalled, and we wonder how they occurred, how they took place, how the world sat by. We judge those, or at least I know I do, who sat by at that time allowing it to happen without getting involved, without speaking out, without stepping out of the comfort zone or taking any responsibility. And I know that so many times I've looked back and asked that question, how did the world sit by and let this happen? In April of 2015, I was at a conference where Rich Stearns, the president of World Vision, was giving a talk, and the talk was entitled, "Syria Needs an Earthquake so that the world will pay attention." Now, I could have told you something, this is 2 years ago, I could have told you something that was going on in Syria, maybe a civil war. I didn't really have any idea what was going on. And while Rich's impassioned talk confronted me for a day or so, I quickly settled back into life as normal. But then Syria did get an earthquake. And then, it did get an earthquake of sorts, and you alluded to it in your story. On Thursday morning, September 3rd, 2015, this photo showed up and rapidly made its way around the world. As I stared at it that morning, unable to quite comprehend it, I thought to myself, this is happening right now. The world is sitting by while millions are dying or fleeing. And it hit me, history is repeating itself, and we're sitting by allowing it to happen. I'm doing exactly what it is that I've judged others in history of doing. So I asked myself, what's it actually going to take for me to pay attention? If this photo can't get me to pay attention to what's happening on the other side of the world, I don't know what will. And I wanted to post the image immediately to social media, quoting something to that extent, but I forced myself to stop thinking, if I exploit this image of this little 3-year-old of someone's baby, then I better be willing to follow through. I better be willing not to just go back to life as normal. And then, as if it hadn't been happening for years, the media started what seemed like non-stop coverage of millions getting into inflatable rubber boats and heading from the Middle East to Europe. And we watched the footage of these way overcrowded, unseaworthy vessels washing into the shores of the Greek island of Lesbos. Some boats designed to carry 8 to 10 people were crammed with up to 80. And we learned that little island wasn't the only one to lose his life at sea. And hearts all over the world were genuinely undone. We were working with World Relief, and I said to my husband, surely there's something we can do. Surely there's people we can talk to. We can rally the church. We can engage with the churches in Europe and in the Middle East and support them. And we just need to get people's attention and capture it that now that everyone is paying attention right now. And at the same time, my friend, author and blogger Anne Voskamp had written a blog post that was a letter to Aylan Kurdi. And she'd put a couple of links to organisations to give to, ways to respond. And she was inundated with responses, particularly from churches and pastors wanting to know what to do, how to respond, and how to lead their congregations. And we determined we need to do something now to give church's tangible action to respond. This is what I ended up posting that Thursday morning. It was a repost of what Anne had posted, an image and a quote from the Independent newspaper. The quote read, "People are dying and they need our help. If we cannot see that, then we have no right to look away from the consequences of inaction." And I was reminded of the statements around the time of the Holocaust. I didn't want my grandkids to look back and wonder why I didn't do anything during the greatest humanitarian crisis of our time. And Anne, with this post so eloquently, wrote, as she does, "There's always enough abundance and grace to welcome those in need, because it's only by abundant grace that any of us are here. And if there's abundant grace for us by God, then there's abundant grace for all of us. That's why all of us, from sea to sea, across the sea, we're not looking away from you, island. The whole world murmurs their repentant beckoning, island. Come to our shores, come to our tables, come to our hearths, come fill our playgrounds with your laughter, and come fill our land with your dreams." We knew that we only had a moment while the world's attention was captured before it moved on to business as usual. We knew we needed to capture the momentum that was rising and the desire to engage. And we came up with an idea of a trusted web platform that could call churches to respond and give them pathways and practical tools to do so. And by the way, that's pointing to all of you and the work that you're doing. It wasn't we're here, we know what to do. We knew that we just needed to point people in the direction of those who were doing the work. And so it was birthed We Welcome Refugees, a website that we hoped could encourage and mobilise the church and keep the refugee crisis front of mind when the media and the world's attention inevitably moved on. A place that could connect the North American church with churches on the ground in Europe and the Middle East who were doing the work of welcoming refugees, flooding their cities and shores. And we were immediately inundated with those wanting to take in a refugee family into their home, those who wanted to welcome, to give, who wanted to donate, who wanted to serve, who wanted to do absolutely anything they could because their hearts are being captured by this image of 3-year-old Island Curdy, because they'd seen the boats washing up on the beach and they knew that only the desperate would flee their homes to take to an inflatable raft on the sea. And our reach grew wider and wider, and we were able to provide a place for folks to come and see how they could engage and where they could go and serve in their own communities. We became a place that provided answers and resources. We continued to talk about the refugee crisis and keep it in the forefront of those who had chosen to engage. Churches signed up to be involved in National Refugee Sunday campaigns and actively sought out resources and pathways to engage with refugees. And then in November of that same year, a series of coordinated terrorist attacks occurred in Paris and refugees were blamed. Whether it actually was the work of refugees was irrelevant. Fear had set in and the pedals were quickly being turned backwards. We saw the effect immediately, and people who had signed up to say, "We welcome refugees," let us know that, in fact, they no longer did. That they care for refugees and their situation was really unfortunate, much like the Australian who was saying, "We hope you find a solution." But the safety of their own families had to come first. We just can't take the risk. Help them where they are, don't bring them here. And suddenly all refugees who only weeks before were being offered beds in people's homes were branded as terrorists. The very people the refugees were fleeing from were causing fear and darkness to rule. Hatred, vitriol, and lies began to take over. And suddenly, for We Welcome Refugees, we moved from seeking to keep the plight of refugees on the radar to seeking to change the narrative about refugees. At the same time, I was able to go to Jordan to meet with refugees from Syria and Iraq and to hear their stories. On this trip, I joined forces with the phenomenal humanitarian photographer Esther Havens, who has become one of my dearest friends. And the photos that I'll be showing later on are all images that Esther has taken. Esther's been doing this work for a long time, and working with her taught me a lot about storytelling, about placing value on people in their story, about relationship, and about proximity. And over the course of a number of trips to the Middle East together, we've had the absolute privilege of sitting in the homes of refugees, be they one-room apartments, tents, shipping containers. But each time we were met with incredible hospitality and heard heartbreaking stories that no doubt most of you know all too well, and exact stories of what we heard tonight. We met those who've lost everything from material possessions to children and other family members, many still unaware of where their loved ones were, if they were even still alive. We met those who know they have no future, that their only hope is to survive in their current situation till one day they can hopefully maybe return home and rebuild everything. And yet we saw a resilience, a hopefulness, a determinedness that I'm not sure I would be strong enough to have. We received a hospitality that we don't often get to experience in our white Western culture. We observed community and culture and family that will always look out for one another. The photo that's going to come up now is Jasmine. She's the first refugee woman that I met and we went into her home where she lives with her 3 children, and her husband was in Turkey as it was the only place he was able to find work, and they remained separated. Her parents were still in Syria, and she had so much fear and uncertainty for their future. She was 24 years old. She described it as like being a fish out of water, gasping for air. Jasmine and I stayed in contact over WhatsApp after I left, and I'll never forget this one statement she said to me as I was preparing to share her story to a group of college students. And I asked her what she would have me say, and she said, please ask them to remember that regardless of our differing cultures, religions, faiths, we are all one humanity, and that our suffering is not suffering when your hearts are interconnected with ours. I returned from that first trip from my time spent with refugees determined more than ever to not sit by and let this all just happen on our watch, to continue to raise awareness and to continue to call the church to respond. I wish that I could say that was easy. After Paris, and you all know too well, and the continued coverage of refugees flooding into Europe, the tide has continued to change. The shooting in San Bernardino, again, regardless of facts, continued to give Americans an excuse not to engage in what would cause a loss of comfort and a pushing through of fears. Fear-mongering and widespread misinformation continue to fuel those fears and those stereotypes. I understood some of the fears, not so much a lot of the concerns, because I knew the facts, and I had sat and looked into the eyes of these people who were being painted as something that they weren't. But even still, as Christians, we're called to walk a different path. Fast forward to today, and the response of the white evangelical church in America has actually become more opposed to welcoming refugees. A recent piece in Christianity Today said, the Pew Research Center has found that self-identified white evangelicals were twice as likely as Americans overall to support the policy by 76 versus 38%, which temporarily halts the refugee program and restricts entry from several Muslim-majority countries. They are also the only religious group in America that has grown more supportive of a Muslim ban. Most evangelical Christians say that their opinions on refugees are not influenced by the Bible. When you consider this, we have a lot of work to do in order to change public opinion. Both the authenticity and the relevance of our faith are at stake. And as Stephen said last night, we're at a crossroads as a country and as a people of faith. Scott Arbiter, the president of World Relief, calls it a crisis of discipleship. And honestly, I couldn't agree more. Esther and I had another trip planned to the Middle East last year, and we talked about how we could help change the narrative around how refugees were perceived here in the US, about how we could tell stories that would help people see who refugees were, that their circumstances of being a refugee did not define them, but that in fact they were human beings created in God's image, and in fact they were just like us. We intentionally took this photo of Esther and I with 2 Muslim women wearing hijabs just to try and create some cognitive dissonance around the perception of Muslim women within American culture. This image is of a young Muslim man we met in Lebanon. We couldn't show his face clearly because his fears of his family, should the stories he shared with us fall into the wrong hands. But we deliberately wanted to tell his story to show a different narrative of Arab men than the one that we hear in Western media. The fact that he's just desperately trying to provide for his own family, as well as the generation above, all living together in a small tent on a farm in Lebanon. The fact that he's highly educated, he's a businessman who's lost everything, who's unable to work because the small country of Lebanon is already overwhelmed by refugees who make up more than 50% of their population, and there is just not the work to go around. Being a refugee or stereotyped as someone to be feared should not define Imad, and yet it does. And so we continue to gather stories and share stories, seeking to show the humanity, seeking to show the image of God in each person, seeking to challenge our understanding of how we view, judge, and stereotype refugees. Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie talks about the danger of the single story narrative. She's got a fantastic TED talk on it if you haven't seen it. She says that when all we know is one side of someone's story, the tragedy or catastrophe part of their story, it dispossesses and it robs them of dignity. It makes it difficult for us to see them as equal of us. It empathizes how we're different rather than how we're similar. She says there are many stories that are not just about catastrophe, and it's just as important to tell those stories also. It is impossible to engage properly with a place or a person without engaging with all the stories of that place or person. Stories become ingrained in our social subconscious, and when they are reinforced through how society engages them, they begin to shape policies, and they actually define a national identity, and we're seeing that play out right now. The narrative that all refugees, particularly those who are Muslims, are terrorists and to be feared is already having a far-reaching effect across American culture, policies, and general societal engagement. Chimamanda also says stories matter, many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that dignity. Trying to change the refugee narrative is so complex because we want to change the perception society has of refugees, but in so doing, we often only tell the catastrophic story, and unfortunately what that does is perpetuate the victimization and the oppression of refugees. She quotes Palestinian poet Murad Barghouti, and I've probably butchered that name, I'm sorry as well, but he calls this when we start with secondly. So when we reduce a refugee story and therefore when we don't tell all of the story, when we don't start it at the beginning, we dispossess and we stereotype. When we reduce a refugee story and therefore their experience to just that of displacement or loss, we see them as less than us. Their story continues to be that of the passive victim and those to whom we need to give charity and sympathy. When we reduce their story to seeing them as greedy, needy, demanding, lazy, or uncultured, we create a power structure where they are alienated and therefore unable to integrate into the community, and we strip them of ability and identity. And when we reduce their story to seeing them as those who need to be feared, we create a society that is fearful and distrustful, and we breed isolation and further polarization. Now, of course, none of this is new to most of you in the room, as you no doubt deal with all of these things as in how you engage and relate with the refugees that you work with and that you know and love. But how do we influence this at the level of national identity? How do we change how refugees are portrayed in the media, in our churches, in our communities, and in our families? We need lots of stories, many stories, not just the horrific stories. I have a lot more to say, but I'm running out of time, so I'm going to jump to the end. We need to let refugees tell their stories, and we need to encourage them to do that, and we need to find pathways for them to do that. Sorry, just deciding what to drop out. The Nigerian author Chinua Achebe calls this process restoring, where there becomes a balance of stories, where people are able to contribute to a definition of themselves, where they are not victims of other people's accounts. He says, this is not to say that nobody should write about anybody else. I think they should. But those that have been written about should also participate in the making of these stories. If you only hear one side of the story, you have no understanding at all. And we do need to do both. There are times when my voice is going to be heard and someone else's is not. And I want to take advantage of that. I want to use whatever influence I have to advocate and provide a different perspective. But I need to be careful that this work that I do doesn't become about me and the value that I bring. I need to be willing to step aside and let those who are marginalized share their own stories. As Jason said in our advocacy table talk yesterday, we need to pass the mic. And I was so grateful for Ruth's question in that session of how do we get to have our voices heard? And I believe that this is exactly the question that we must figure out an answer to, or history will continue to repeat itself through not only our apathy toward what is happening to our brothers and sisters around the world, but also through what will become a continued systemic oppression of another entire people, those who are lumped together as a single-faceted group called refugees. There's so much we could go into as to how to practically do this, and I did want to give you some practical tools because no doubt many of you are already telling stories or helping refugees to tell their stories, or you have a desire to do so and you don't know how. First of all, you already have the most important piece. You have relationship and you have proximity. And it requires the ability to listen, to ask questions that will start the story at the beginning. And again, no doubt, so many of you already know these stories, but what can you do with them? Firstly, it's really important to know that someone wants their story to be told and that they know exactly how and where it's being used. If that's not the case, then they're being exploited. Secondly, share the stories wherever you're able to within the parameters of that permission. Maybe it's your organization's social media page, maybe your personal social media pages, blog sites, etc. Send them to us at We Welcome Refugees. Send them to Tess over there. We don't currently have a plan for this, but we'll work on it. Include a great photo or photo images that honor and provide dignity, who show the person you're talking about or whose story you're telling or whose story they are telling, smiling and alive. Remember that we're intentionally creating a new narrative, the one you get to see but the majority of our culture does not. And lastly, whether this is right or wrong, I don't know, but I always write stories I'm presenting of another person in the first person. I record my conversation with them with permission, and then I transcribe it and use that to create the story. It's always their words, their story, not my version of their story. And that may not be possible in every circumstance, but it's something I've intentionally tried to do. Ask questions that will get them to think outside of the narrative they probably already have playing in their head about who they are or what they think you want to hear. Remember that most refugees have had to create a narrative that gets them asylum, that gets them the ability to go to another country, and that has become the story that defined them. Ask them about exactly the sorts of questions you were asking tonight. What are your hopes and dreams for the future? And begin to create avenues for refugees to share their stories. Create storytelling nights or poetry reading events in your community where refugees can get up and take the mic, where they can share their story, or any story. It doesn't have to be their personal story. And where they can write, where they can create, and begin to have an outlet for voices to be heard. This is going to take time and encouragement and definitely relationship, but let's figure this out together. It's way too important. And in closing, I just, again, want to reiterate what an encouragement you all are, what a light in the darkness you are. And Isaiah 58 talks about when we share food with the hungry and provide the poor wanderer with shelter, when you clothe the naked, when you see them, and when you don't turn away, when you don't turn away from your own flesh and blood, then your light will break forth like the dawn. It will rise in the darkness and become like the noonday. If light does not penetrate the darkness, more darkness will prevail. The light is the way to the cut through the darkness. And when I sit with refugees and hear their stories and hear the horror, and it's overwhelming, it's paralyzing. Facing the darkness and brokenness is hard, and I don't want to see it. I don't want to stay in it. But then I see the light, and the light are the workers. The light are you guys. Your light is shining the way. You give me courage to keep speaking, to keep pushing through the darkness and keep from turning away. Because whilst the injustice and brokenness of this world can be overwhelming, when you focus on those doing good, the light begins to outshine the darkness. And like Stephen said last night, you are doing much more good than you think. Thank you.